Hi, I'm Stephanie, and this is the Headlines and Tidbits podcast. Here, we dust off forgotten, bizarre, and unbelievable stories pulled straight from old newspapers. In each full episode, I take a single headline that caught my attention, something strange, unsettling, or just too compelling to ignore, and walk you through the real story behind it, the people involved, what happened, and how it unfolded. All right, let's get into today's headline. Today's headline comes from the Rocky Mountain News, dated August 22nd, 1928, and it reads, 7 men finally conquer wild man of Black Mountain. This immediately raises a few questions. Who was this wild man? Why did it take 7 men to capture him? And what exactly was happening on Black Mountain in the summer of 1928? This wild man, his name was Harry Beeler. And Harry was born on May 4th, 1883 in Kansas. He grew up in a small family with his parents, Josiah and Anna Beeler, and a younger sister named Beulah. By 1900, the family was living in Colorado. The family bought a farm, and Harry started working for the post office. However, by 1910, he was working on the family farm, helping to take care of the land and cattle. So I guess it was really more of a ranch. Now, before we dive fully into Harry's story, I want to talk about his sister for a little bit, because she has kind of an interesting story. Beulah, she married a David M. Evans on July 5th, 1906 in Pueblo, Colorado, and the couple moved to Montrose, Colorado, where they settled down and ran a ranch of their own. But 6 years after they married, David just took off. On Sunday, March 10th, 1912, David removed all of his clothing from the house and sold the couple's horses. He did this without Beulah knowing. The next day, he secretly boarded a train to the state of Washington and left her behind, wondering where he went. She eventually went to the police, and they put out a warrant for his arrest for desertion. But 2 years later, Beulah was informed that David had been murdered in Seattle, Washington. He was walking down the street when he was shot in the back and killed. The murder went unsolved, and Beulah returned to her family ranch to live and never remarried. I just thought that was kind of an interesting story, so I wanted to add that in. But let's get back to Harry's story. Harry's father, Josiah, he died in 1918, and his death left his wife, Annie, his daughter, Beulah, and Harry to manage the property and care for the cattle on their own. And as you can imagine, that was a tremendous amount of work. And in the years that followed, Harry's mental health began to decline. But everything changed on Monday, August 13th, 1928. Beulah died suddenly at just 40 years old from an enlarged heart. And with Beulah's death, the family secret was finally revealed. A few days after Beulah passed away, authorities in Park County, Colorado, uncovered a shocking secret that had been hidden for more than a decade on the Beeler family ranch. Harry Beeler had been kept chained inside a dark log cabin for 12 years by his own mother. When officers finally found him, the scene was horrifying. Harry was described as wild, filthy, and nearly animal-like. His hair was long and matted, and his beard had grown down to his abdomen. He was completely naked and had apparently been without clothing for the entire 12 years of his confinement. Now, this seems a little odd to me. I mean, it gets cold in Colorado during the winter, but I guess if the cabin was heated well enough and he had blankets, I don't know. It's hard to say with newspapers. Sometimes they elaborate. But anyways, for all that time, he had been shackled with an iron chain fastened to a belt around his waist, along with a leather band around his ankle. The chain was attached to iron brackets in the wall, allowing him to move only 3 or 4 feet. Inside the cabin, conditions were unbearable. The floor was covered in filth and debris, and the smell was described as overwhelming. Insects scurried across the ground. A makeshift bed sat just within reach of the chain. So Harry had lived in almost total darkness, and when he was finally brought outside, the sunlight hurt his eyes, according to reports. It was the first time he had seen the sun since 1916. So this shocking situation was uncovered when Sheriff Fred L. Richards and his deputies traveled to the Beeler Ranch after hearing rumors that a man was chained up there. When the officers arrived, they found Harry's elderly mother sitting on the porch of the ranch house. Nearby, set back in the yard, stood the small log cabin where Harry had been kept. So, peering through the cabin's only window, officers saw him standing in the dim interior. And the article described him as, quote, hairy, filthy, a shadow in the darkness except for the glistening whites of his rolling eyes. So when the sheriff pried the padlock from the door and opened it, the officers cautiously stepped inside, and Harry suddenly jumped at them, letting out a strange cry described as more like a dog's bark than a human voice, which is pretty terrifying. But the attack stopped abruptly when the chains pulled tight, jerking him off his feet. He rose again, growling and grinding his teeth, while the officers realized he could move only a few feet from where he was shackled. So now, the most shocking part of the story was that Harry's mother admitted she had kept him imprisoned there, but she insisted she had done it out of love. Through tears, the elderly woman explained that Harry had once been committed to an insane asylum in Pueblo after serving time in the state prison. She blamed those experiences for driving him completely insane. She told reporters that the Beeler family had originally come to Colorado from Kansas in 1898 after her husband's bank failed during a financial panic. They borrowed money and purchased a 1,200-acre ranch on Black Mountain where they hoped to rebuild their lives in the cattle business. Harry was just a teenager at that time, and according to his mother, he loved the cowboy life. But when Harry was about 30 years old, everything seemed to change. One day, the sheriff arrived at the ranch and arrested him for cattle stealing. Miss Beeler insisted the charge was unfair. She believed that other cowboys had framed Harry to get him out of the way. Either way, Harry was convicted and sent to the state prison in Canyon City. Not long after his imprisonment, the family received a letter from the warden saying that Harry's mind had given away, and he was transferred to the state insane asylum in Pueblo. When his family went to visit him there, Miss Beeler said she was horrified by his condition. She claimed he was being treated cruelly, and that when Harry saw her, he immediately began to cry. She told her husband, "We must get Harry home." Eventually, with permission from the governor, the family was allowed to take Harry back to their ranch. But by then, his behavior had become so dangerously unpredictable, and according to his mother, the only way she believed she could keep him and everyone else safe was to chain him inside the cabin. But she also explained that she cared for him the best she could. Every night she would bring him food, then leave a blanket for him while he slept. Despite the terrible circumstances, she insisted and told the sheriff, quote, "Harry is a good boy and I love him." She said she did it out of love. According to later accounts, Miss Beeler never believed she had done anything wrong. So when officers finally removed him from the cabin, Harry fought them fiercely, and they described it as like fighting a tiger. And deputies eventually were able to subdue him and placed handcuffs on him and wrapped him in a blanket. As the sheriff prepared to take Harry, his elderly mother stood nearby watching the scene unfold. Throwing up her arms in despair, she cried out, "Goodbye, son, they are taking you away from me." The article said that he had not bathed in 12 years and had worn no clothing the entire time. And when he was brought to the Fairplay jail, crowds gathered to see the man who had been called the Wild Man of the Mountains. People who remembered Harry years earlier said he had once been a cowboy working on the large Beeler cattle ranch, which at one time was one of the finest ranches in Colorado, but now he appeared completely unrecognizable. Witnesses said he stared back at the crowd, baring his teeth like fangs, lunging at the bars of his cell and snarling. And authorities quickly decided that Harry didn't belong in the local jail. He actually needed to be sent back to the state hospital in Pueblo, where he had originally been confined. And when Harry arrived at the state hospital, attendants immediately gave him something he had not experienced in more than a decade: a bath, a shave, and clean clothing. Because during the 12 years he'd been chained in the cabin, his family had been too afraid to bathe him. And hospital officials said it took 8 attendants to escort him into the hospital and to give him a bath and help him get changed. But doctors later reported that once he had the bath and clean clothes, he started to calm down a little bit, which is interesting. However, Harry's mother was fighting the doctors. She wanted to take him back, and they told her, "He's better off here. We can actually care for him. We can give him a bath. We can take care of his needs." But sympathy was growing for Harry's mom in the public. People in Fairplay saw her the days after Harry was taken wandering through town, and she would go to the hospital every day and beg for the doctors to let him go. But of course they didn't. She would bring food saying that they weren't feeding him properly. And many people told reporters in the days that followed that they remembered the Beeler Ranch and the Beeler family being one of the most wealthiest ranches in the region, but now it was overrun with weeds. There wasn't any cattle on the ranch. But the story took one more strange turn after Harry arrived at the state hospital in Pueblo. According to later newspaper reports, Harry began shouting the same chilling sentence over and over again when he arrived at the hospital. He would say, "I've killed John Martin. There's blood on my hands." And so authorities took this claim seriously, and Sheriff Fred L. Richards began investigating whether a man named John Martin had been murdered somewhere near the Beeler Ranch. But after searching records, missing person reports, and questioning people in the area, officials could find no evidence that anyone by that name had been killed or reported missing. So whether Harry's confession was the result of a delusion, a fragment of a memory, or something else entirely, no one ever figured it out. So 2 years later, after Harry had been taken from the home, the strange story of the Beeler Ranch resurfaced once again. In July of 1930, a fire broke out on the property and destroyed the very cabin where Harry had once been chained for 12 years. Harry's mother, who was alone in the house at the time, watched the cabin burn, and by morning the shack was completely gone. And 6 years later, in May of 1934, Harry Beeler's mother, her name was Anna Beeler, was dying in St. Mary's Hospital in Pueblo after she developed pneumonia. Before she passed, she made one final request that her son Harry be brought from the state mental hospital to be brought to her bedside. And they escorted Harry into her hospital room. And according to newspaper reports, he gazed at his mother with kind of only a dim understanding of what was going on. He leaned forward and she whispered something in his ear. And then about an hour or so later, his mother died and Harry was taken back to the mental hospital. Reports said that they're not really sure that Harry even understood what happened. And this is kind of a sad and weird quote. One newspaper noted at the time, "Now Harry, the quote ape man, was the last of the Beelers." And Harry, he remained at the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo for the rest of his life. And nearly a decade later, in August of 1943, Harry died there at the age of 60. And that's where we will leave today's story. And thank you so much for listening to Headlines and Tidbits. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following or subscribing so you don't miss future stories pulled from the pages of the past. See you next time.